English by the Nature Method, Chapter 47, the 47th chapter, A Busy Sunday. Marshall explained to Storm that the so-called East End, where they were now, is part of East London. Most of the people in the East End are very poor, he said, and you will often find two families living together in the same flat or in a one-family house. These people live under very bad conditions, but the poor in the large cities all over the world live under conditions just as bad, I think. To Storm's question if there were any stores in this part of the town, Marshall answered, "You will not find many stores in the East End. Most of the shops here are rather small. You will notice that fruit is cheap in the East End. This is a store. It's a large shop. I must remember to buy some fruit for my mother, because the price here is much lower than in our suburb." After having bought the fruit, Marshall said that there were 2 or 3 streets that he wished to show Storm. They sell nothing but cats, dogs, birds, and other domestic animals in those streets. We English love domestic animals very much, and every Sunday morning large numbers of cats, dogs, and birds are sold in the East End. This is a cat. Before long, they reached one of the streets that Marshall had mentioned, and they saw that every third or fourth person had bought a dog and had it on a chain. "Storm, I'm always sorry to see a man walking with his dog on a chain, but of course it's necessary for a man who has just bought a dog to have it on a chain at first every time he walks out with it, until he is sure that the dog knows its new home and will not run away. After that he may let it run loose when he takes it out. Marshall, I quite agree with you, but it's not always possible. In this busy part of the town, for example, you cannot let the dogs run loose, for they would very quickly run into the middle of the street and perhaps get under a car or get run over, as we say. In several of the suburbs, however, it's possible to let them go loose. Speaking of dogs, I don't like the way some kinds of dogs have part of their tails cut off just because it's thought beautiful by some of the so-called friends of dogs." "Storm, no, I also prefer them with their tails." The two friends now began walking along the street, and soon their noses told them what was sold there, for they could smell the animals. Storm said that he had smelled something like it when he went with his friends to the zoo. Seeing some very beautiful birds and cats in a shop, they went inside to have a better look at them. They spent several minutes there playing with a small cat, which jumped up on Storm's shoulder as soon as they entered the shop. But at last Marshall said, "We must leave now. There's still a lot more on our program for today, so we had better move on. My real purpose in taking you out today was to show you the many different things we do on Sundays, and as it's my purpose to get through all our program before we return, we'll now go on to one of the shops that sell beer and other strong drinks. A shop of this kind is called a public house, or a pub for short, and in England we have so many of them that we say that there is a pub on every street corner." In less than a minute they reached a public house. Storm was surprised to find that the shop was so full of people drinking that many had to stand outside with the glasses in their hands. Storm was all the more surprised because he had always thought that public houses in England were closed on Sundays. A man that had had a little too much to drink dropped his glass, which was at once smashed to pieces. Another man, who had had far too much to drink, seemed to like the noise, for he at once picked up his glass and smashed it too. "I'm afraid that you are getting one surprise after another," Marshall said. but you are really seeing the East End on a Sunday morning." It was very difficult for the man to stand on his feet. Some of his friends tried to support him by holding his arms, but although they supported him as well as they could, he suddenly fell to the ground. "If that is a typical picture of an English public house, I'm sure that people break many glasses in this way," said Storm. "You're right," Marshall replied. "Thousands of glasses must get broken every year, but this is not a typical English pub. At least, it's only typical of some pubs in the East End. But now, I think we will leave the East End, not because we have seen all that is to be seen, but because our time is limited. I must say, Storm, that I find the East End one of the most interesting parts of London." "Yes, that may be so, but you would not like to exchange your own suburb for this place, would you? You would not exchange your house for a house in the East End, with another family living in it. But you said that our time was limited, as our program was so long. What are we going to do now?" Marshall replied, looking at his watch, that it was an hour or two past lunch time, and that before that he could think of doing anything else, they must have some lunch and a little rest, and later he would take Storm to church. "Without a visit to a church," he told Storm, "I can't give you a really typical picture of a Sunday in London. Before the First World War the English were a church-going nation, and they still are, even if perhaps fewer people go to church now. Most of those who go to church on Sundays go because they really want to and feel that they could not do without it. But there are, of course, some who only go because they think it is the proper thing to do. Their parents and grandparents went to church, and so they go too." Storm: "Yes, in my country it's almost the same. Many people, for example, go to church only on the 24th or the 25th of December, because they think it's the proper thing to do, perhaps because they have always done so. But there are, of course, also a great many people who go to church every Sunday because they really want to." It took the two friends more time to get through their lunch than they had expected. They spent more than 2 hours eating and reading the Sunday papers. "We are a little late now," Marshall said. "There is a service in a church a quarter of an hour's walk from here, so we must hurry." When they reached the church, the service had already begun, and the clergyman had just appeared. Before the clergyman began to speak, however, Marshall found time to say to Storm in a very low voice, "Listen carefully now. You will hear many strange old expressions that are not in use any more, but a clergyman usually speaks so slowly in church and in such a loud voice that I have no doubt you will be able to hear and find out the meaning of most of the words and expressions. You will recognize the matter he is speaking about, of course, and that will help too." The clergyman had a strong voice that sounded rather pleasant, and it was quite an experience for Storm to hear the many old English words and expressions which sounded very strange and also very beautiful to his ears, as he told Marshall after the service was over. Shortly after 7, they left the church and went to a restaurant for a cup of tea. "We have had a very busy day," said Storm, "and I think that your program could hardly have been better." "Do you think perhaps," Marshall asked, "that our program is finished already? Just as soon as we have had enough tea and bread and butter, we'll go and see a good film." "See a good film?" said Storm in a great surprise. "You must have forgotten that the cinemas are closed today. That is again the strange idea that foreigners have of England. There are in all far more than 200 towns in England in which the cinemas are open on Sundays." They went to cinema in Leicester Square, and before going in, stood for a time on one of the 4 sides of the square, looking at the great number of very bright lights outside most of the buildings. The lights were so bright that it was almost like daylight. They went inside the cinema, which was so comfortable that it was almost like a palace. The prices were rather high. Marshall told Storm that they must pay for all the comforts. If you want to have all modern comforts, you will usually find that you have to pay for them in some way or other. They saw a war film, and when they left the cinema, they agreed that they didn't wish to see any more war films for a long time to come. It was about an Englishman who had been taken by the Germans, but after a lot of trouble he had got away from them and escaped to Sweden, where he received a shock on hearing that both his parents were dead, and that his wife had run away with another man. Marshal, I have a brother who also escaped from Germany during the war, but I am glad to say that nothing unpleasant had taken place in his family which might give him a shock when he got back. When they got home that evening, Storm thanked his guide and said, "I'm sure this has been the most interesting Sunday I have spent for a long time, full of surprises from morning till night." Marshall's parents had gone to bed, but as he and Storm were both hungry after the long and tiring day, they went into the kitchen, where they found some cold supper which Mrs. Marshall had left for them. They made themselves some tea to drink with their supper.